I remember my first Christmas as a minister in the granite city of Abington in Scotland. The year was 1965, the year of Selma, the year of the first US walk in space, the year that T.S. Eliot died, the year that New York City was blacked out, the year that Gary Player won the US Open and the Phillies sank to 6th in the National League, and the year that I first met a vivacious and highly talented girl from California. With all the enthusiasm of youth, I decided to hold a Christmas Eve carol service to welcome Mary's boy child. And out of a congregation of 800, about 40 turned up. The next day, December the 25th, most of the shops were open because the Scots would wait for Hogmanay to really celebrate. 5 years later, it was all changed. 5 years later, 1970, there was a queue 100 yards long outside the church of people who couldn't get in on Christmas Eve. So what brought that about? Some said it was the preaching, and they were well paid. But others, perhaps a little bit more perceptive, said it was the advent of television, when the Scots began to realize what Christmas festivities were all about. 1965 was the end of a long tradition, a long Presbyterian tradition, which reflected that if Peter and Paul felt no need to celebrate Christmas Day, if the Christian church in its most expansionist phase felt no need to invent an official birthday for Jesus, then the faith would be none the worse for it, for the early church had no Christmas. And such feelings had long persisted in the land of Robbie Burns and John Knox and the makers of Glenfiddich. The mother church of Presbyterianism would have nothing to do with that superstitious day called Yule. And as far back as 1583, they had put people out of the kirk for observing the superstitious day called Yuletide. 10 years later, in Glasgow, they were barring from the Lord's Supper those who were keeping Christmas Day. And that was the mother church. Why? Well, because they were Bible-believing Christians. And they opened their New Testament and they discovered there that Paul said there was no place for special holy days, there was no space for festival days, there was only one special day, and that was the Lord's Day, the day of the resurrection. And it wasn't just happening in the old country, it was also happening in this country, because at the same time, the legislature of the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a law outlawing the observance of Christmas. And so the festivity of Thanksgiving Day became a kind of substitute. And that law remained on the statute books for 2 decades. Now, those old-time pilgrims were right about 2 things. They were right, first of all, about what the Scripture says and about the New Testament. Because they knew that those New Testament believers would no more have thought of celebrating the Roman feast of Saturnalia on the 25th of December, the goddess of agriculture, than they would have thought of offering incense to a Roman Caesar. Jesus did indeed turn the world upside down, and the tradition was that at the feast of Saturnalia, the world also turned upside down. Masters served their servants, gambling was legal, and people enjoyed great banquets of peacock eggs and pepper sauce. But Jesus had nothing whatever to do with December the 25th. Jesus was not in Christmas. And the second thing that those old pilgrims understood was that the incarnation, if you really understood it, was not to do with the celebration of one day in the Christian year, but was the celebration of every day. That Jesus had not come as an excuse for dissipation, but as a call for costly dedication. That Jesus had not come as an excuse for overeating and overdrinking in one particular day, but had come to offer us the very opposite, which was something to do with the soul, Jesus as the bread of life. They understood that there was no point in putting Jesus on show as God's good gift for 24 hours if we didn't plan to live by his precepts for the rest of the year. Put Christ into Christmas? That's Reader's Digest religion. Whatever for? If we manage to ignore his real demands for 364 days in the year, why would we get sentimental on the last one? Don't you see? A world which idolizes wealth has long since abandoned any claim to follow the one for whom there was no room in the inn. An age which admires success can only feel embarrassed by one whose life's work ended up on a gibbet, nailed to a cross. And a society which spawns the NRA and the power of the gun is surely not very well qualified to sing peace on earth and goodwill among men. In other words, the challenge to discipleship is not paganism at all. The challenge to real discipleship is sentimentality in the hearts of those who claim to follow the Christ. What I'm suggesting to you is this: that those Scots Presbyterians, those English Puritans, were not the killjoys of the cartoonists. They were a breed of people who took very seriously their faith, far more seriously than we do, and they knew their Bibles a great deal better than we know them. And they understood that the real Jesus of history is no more the toast of the kingdoms of Thatcher and Reagan and Carter than he was the toast of the kingdoms of Herod and Pilate and Caesar, for he is like a refiner's fire. And who may abide the day of his coming? Those old-timers didn't go in very much for ecclesiastical colors. Had they done so, they would have understood why, if the secular culture for Christmas is red, red is for jollity, the church color for Advent and Christmas was always purple, purple for the coming of the King, purple which is the color of Lent, purple for judgment and penitence, and getting ready for the coming of the King. So, prepare ye the way of the Lord. Take Christ out of Christmas is the very opposite of what the literalists assume it means. It's rather the challenge to replace sentiment with discipleship, a faith which centers on a crib with a faith that understands the cross, faith not as cozy feeling inside, but faith as costly choices that change our whole direction of life, faith not in terms of Bing Crosby, but faith in terms of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and John Calvin and St. Paul and Jesus himself.